I've attended the births of hundreds of babies as a family doctor, and I've come to believe that at no time is the Hippocratic injunction to first do no harm more important than during the birth of a baby after a healthy pregnancy. I want to tell you how I learned not to harm some especially vulnerable newborn babies and their mothers. About 20 years ago, I started working at a clinic that provided methadone to people addicted to opioids. Methadone was then the medication used for what we now call opioid agonist therapy, or OAT for short, which is still the most effective treatment for people dependent on drugs like heroin, morphine, or fentanyl. Nowadays, OAT involves the prescription of a safe legal medication which is dispensed by a health professional like a pharmacist or a nurse. And it can include either methadone or buprenorphine, both of which are long-acting opioids whose effects can last for more than 24 hours, meaning that a patient can go on with the rest of their day without having to worry about going into withdrawal. Withdrawal from opioids is basically the opposite of what the high feels like. Whole body aches and pains and intense anxiety, accompanied by cold sweats, tremors, vomiting, and diarrhea. Added to these are the risks of miscarriage and preterm labor in the case of someone who's pregnant. And because I was a doctor who provided prenatal care, it fell to me to look after most of the women at our clinic who became pregnant while on OAT. OAT in pregnancy results in longer, healthier gestations, in babies who are more likely to have healthy birth weights and are less likely to be infected with HIV or hepatitis C than are the babies delivered to addicted women who aren't offered OAT. Over the years, I witnessed many babies being born into the adverse social conditions that their mothers had to live in, and I started to notice how sometimes well-meaning health professionals like myself unintentionally made things worse. When a baby is born to a mother receiving OAT and the umbilical cord is cut, the newborn baby faces all of the unpleasant symptoms that I just described precisely at the most vulnerable time in its life. It's just been expelled from the dark, warm comfort of the womb into a bright, cold, noisy, stimulating world. Until very recently, modern medicine held that the best place to care for babies facing these symptoms, which in this circumstance we call neonatal abstinence syndrome, or NAS for short, was in the neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU, which will be the last medical acronym that I'll use. In the NICU, staff could watch babies for signs of growing distress and discomfort, in which case they would give them minute doses of oral morphine. They would use just enough morphine to stave off severe withdrawal that could otherwise interfere with a baby's ability to feed, to gain weight, and to regulate its body temperature. Now, opioid withdrawal in adults is intensely unpleasant, but rarely physically dangerous. In newborn babies, by contrast, seizures and death were much feared consequences. So babies were admitted to the NICU, which not only would allow doctors and nurses to treat the withdrawal before it got severe, but it also solved the problem of what to do with these babies who were seemingly abandoned by their drug-addicted mothers. Because historically, the last thing a pregnant woman who disclosed the fact that she was addicted to anyone could expect was sympathy. So typically, she would hide the fact that she was addicted and then would have to leave the hospital shortly after giving birth in order to find drugs to treat her withdrawal. And her baby was in the NICU anyway, and most women were made to feel unwanted and unneeded by the NICU staff. Nowadays, we make an effort to offer pregnant, addicted women treatment with OAT, not only for the beneficial outcomes I mentioned before, but also because it allows a woman to stay in the hospital comfortably after giving birth. So it's a sign of progress that nowadays most opioid-addicted women are offered appropriate treatment. The downside is their babies continue to be born dependent on opioids and at risk of NAS. So there I was, caring for women who in many cases had fallen into this most dangerous form of addiction, injecting opioids, as a way of coping with the after effects of their adverse childhood experiences that could include neglect, physical and sexual abuse, and poverty. It's a great thing to watch a person change before your eyes once she starts on OAT. She goes from hiding in dark alleys and shooting galleries, doing dangerous and illegal things in order to afford her habit, never free from the fear of withdrawal if she doesn't start looking for her next fix before the last one runs out, Whereas at the OAT clinic, on the other hand, she would walk in broad daylight, was greeted by supportive, non-judgmental staff who dispensed a medication that could be consumed orally once a day, leaving the rest of the day free to start addressing some of the problems that had been caused by or worsened by her needle habit. I want to tell you about a patient who I'll call Sarah. Sarah had been sexually abused by her stepfather when she was growing up in an impoverished part of town, one of 4 kids that her single mother struggled to raise on social assistance. Sarah was only 16 when she started injecting heroin. But by the time I met her, at the age of 21, she had stabilized on OAT and had gotten pregnant. And now she and her partner, Dave, had both struggled with addiction, but had gotten clean together and were determined to make a start at raising a family. Sarah attended all of her OAT and prenatal appointments regularly. She and Dave moved out of the shelter into a subsidized apartment, and Sarah made it to full term. And attending her delivery felt like a victory to me. Dave stayed at her side, coaching her through 8 hours of labor, and I'll never forget the moment that I placed her newborn baby on her belly, dried him off, and cut his umbilical cord, and saw the looks of relief and joy on Dave and Sarah's faces as they looked at their perfect little baby nuzzling into the warmth of his mother's body. I felt immense gratitude and satisfaction that I had been able to be part of their journey from struggling street addicts to proud, loving, and excited parents. But then what happened? I had to gently remind her that the NICU staff had arrived to take the baby from her arms, wheel him down the hall, and start watching him for signs of withdrawal. And despite the fact that Sarah was a confident, self-assured young woman, there was no mistaking the fear, guilt, and shame on her face, imagining that she had caused such a terrible problem for her baby that he had to be protected from her by a team of experts. Understanding that addiction is a disease was cold comfort for Sarah when it was time for her to leave the hospital after being discharged 2 days later. She had to leave behind her newborn son in his bassinet in the busy, brightly lit, buzzing NICU. Now, NICUs are responsible for some of the most miraculous successes of modern medicine. Every day, they save the lives of babies who are born dangerously premature or have life-threatening complications. But you couldn't miss the fact that Sarah's baby looked out of place in our NICU. He was big, robust, and vigorous compared to the fragile little preemies and the bassinets around him. And Sarah told me later that every time she visited, she imagined that all the other mothers were thinking, my baby's here because of a medical problem that happened through no fault of my own. She could have spared her baby this suffering if only she hadn't been so selfish. And what about Sarah's baby? Remember, he's just had the roughest day of his life. That morning, the dark, warm comfort of the womb had been transformed into a combination earthquake and straitjacket that pushed him painfully into the world. He must have felt a moment of reprieve when he landed on her warm skin that smelled somehow familiar and heard her unmuffled voice for the first time. But then he was whisked away again, alone and exposed to a room full of machines that beep and hiss. No wonder that Sarah's baby ended up like 80% of the opioid-dependent babies who were admitted to our NICU in those days. Despite Sarah and Dave's frequent visits and Sarah's tireless efforts with a breast pump, after his first 24 hours of life, their son had started to show signs of withdrawal so severe that he had to be treated with morphine. And ask anyone who's ever become addicted to an opioid what their first time using was like, and they'll likely tell you it's a warm feeling like being in a loving embrace where pain and fear melt away and all is calm and content. Pretty much the way you'd expect a newborn baby to feel when it first latches to its mother's breast. And there's the real problem as I see it. Even if these babies weren't already likely to be carrying a genetic predisposition to becoming addicted, wouldn't you be surprised if we weren't priming them for it in the most powerful possible way? Think about it. We're teaching them that the cure for the pain of separation from their mothers is by taking a dose of morphine. So you can imagine how excited I was when I started to read about the Families in Recovery, or FIR unit, in 2010. This was a unit headed by doctors in Vancouver, including Ron Abrahams, who were caring for opioid-addicted mothers in a way that seemed revolutionary. They kept the mothers and babies together in a closed ward, staffed by supportive nurses who were non-judgmental. And these were mothers coming from the most impoverished neighborhood in Canada. Vancouver's downtown east side. But they were given all the space and time they needed to care for their babies in private rooms under close supervision with lots of support. No bright lights and loud noises, lots of opportunity to nurse and cuddle their babies. And guess what happened? The number of babies requiring treatment with morphine dropped by over a half. The baby's length of stay in the hospital decreased, and the number of babies being breastfed increased, all because their mothers were simply given the message that their babies needed them and that they themselves could do the work of comforting and caring for their babies. The mothers, in turn, were offered OAT, trauma-informed counseling, and practical support, and they stuck around. And the number of babies requiring foster placement plummeted. The FIR unit called this practice rooming in, and it was far from a radical new innovation. Most people today don't realize it, but until relatively recently, most hospitals in Western industrialized countries cared for newborn babies separately from their mothers. This only started to change in the 1970s and 80s as a reaction against the medicalization of childbirth. You've probably all watched scenes on TV or in movies of proud new parents standing outside a viewing window at the baby nursery, gazing lovingly from a distance at their newborn baby in one of many bassinets lined up in front of the window, maybe with a nurse standing by in starched white linens helpfully to point out which baby is actually theirs. Nowadays, thanks to the efforts of childbirth activists in the 80s and 90s, rooming in for babies that aren't born opioid dependent is the norm in most hospitals in North America and Europe. The group at the FIR were merely drawing an obvious conclusion. If we recognize that the best place for a newborn baby to make the transition to the world is in its mother's arms, and we know that separation of a baby from its mother can lead to abandonment, abuse, and neglect, why wouldn't we expect the same thing to happen to babies born to opioid-addicted mothers like Sarah, who could surely use all the help they can get? In the middle of 2013, the hospital where I work in Kingston, Ontario, agreed to adopt rooming in as part of an experimental pilot project. Instead of admitting the babies directly to the NICU, we gave them and their mothers a private room with lots of opportunity for mother-infant bonding. And from 1 month to the next, we went from giving morphine to 80% of babies who had been in the NICU to only 14% of babies who roomed in. The baby's average time in the hospital went from 25 days to only 8 days. And the number of babies who were breastfed increased to 83%, which was higher even than the 78% of non-opioid dependent babies born at our hospital at the time. Meanwhile, Sarah got pregnant for a second time and delivered her second child, a daughter, in late 2013. She was very apprehensive about repeating the experience that she'd had 3 years before, and she had to be constantly reassured that this time would be different. And what a relief when, after I placed her newborn baby on her belly, dried her off, and cut her umbilical cord, that's where she stayed. I lingered in the delivery room for about an hour afterward myself, watching the baby nuzzle in and nurse at Sarah's breast while Dave watched from the side. And I noticed that from time to time, Sarah or Dave would glance up anxiously towards the door and then seem to remember that there was no nasty surprise coming. Sarah and her baby were admitted to a private room that the hospital had reserved for them, where Dave could sleep alongside in a cot, and the baby's older brother could visit with his grandmother. 5 days later, Sarah and her daughter left the hospital without a single drop of morphine having been delivered. In the years since, our hospital has adopted rooming in as the standard way of caring for opioid-dependent babies. And the results have only gotten better. In the last 5 years, only 3% of babies who room in have required treatment with morphine, and the average length of stay has dropped from 8 days to just 5 days. Studies from around the world, from hospitals that have adopted rooming in, have shown pretty much the same thing. Basically, that mother's milk is way better than morphine. Besides me, our team has consisted of a hospital social worker, a nurse practitioner, and a family and community support worker from a fantastic program that our hospital launched in order to care for opioid-addicted mothers in the community. All we did was to recognize that it's a tough world to be born into, and you can't get any more vulnerable than a newborn baby, let alone one who's born to a woman struggling with addiction, living in adverse circumstances in a society that looks down on addicts as weak-willed and selfish. If we recognize that the best place for a newborn baby is in the arms of the person best equipped to care for and love it, and we can do that just by not shaming and judging its mother, and by not doing something expensive and actually harmful, imagine how much better that baby's life could be.